Next, we are going to hear from Dr. Paroma Ghose. She is a postdoctoral researcher based at the International History and Politics Department at the Graduate Institute in Geneva, Switzerland, where she completed her PhD in 2020. Her doctoral thesis used the lyrics of French rap to write a history of the other in France between 1981 and 2012, and earned her the Pierre Dubois Prize for the best doctoral thesis in history. She is also a contributor to the Cambridge Companion to Global Rap, to be published in 2023, and is also a regular correspondent for a bilingual French and English podcast series on the culture of human rights, produced by Project Utopia 3 in Geneva. Her work experience has been primarily in the humanitarian sector, and she strives to retain a link between her intellectual pursuits and the world of work, particularly through collaborations with local organizations and initiatives that combine education and music and art in both Switzerland and India. So today, Dr. Ghose will be sharing her paper entitled Quand, Justice, Slalom, Belonging and Existing in France Through the Voices of the Marginalised, 1981 to 2012.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Because I usually speak pretty loud. Is it fine? Oh, no. If I speak like this, is that better? No? Like this? Okay. Please let me know if you can't hear me. I might drop off in the middle. Thank you so much for being here with us early in the morning, and thank you, Timothée, for the idea for this panel. I'm really excited to share my work, particularly amongst colleagues who are working on very similar topics, which really doesn't happen very often. So thank you. My paper draws on my doctoral research, as Christy said, and I used the lyrics of French rap, so it was primarily a lyrical discourse that I was analyzing, and this paper draws on that. And I bracketed it within the time period of 1981 and 2012, because 1981 is when the first rapped verse appeared in a song in France. It was a chanson française song. And 2012 was the end of the Sarkozy era, which saw a peak in the appearance of a lot of politically engaged French rap, but was also 2 years before the beginning of my PhD, so was at the limit of what my department considered history, so I had to cut it off. And I'm going to come to to take apart the term other that I used to sort of classify the marginalization that I noticed through French rap, and we'll come to that a little later in the presentation, because it will, as I hope you'll see, take into account people from a medley of different backgrounds. So this paper takes its name from a quote seen here in its longer version by rapper MC Solar, who saw his popularity peak in the late 1990s, early 2000s, and he has been predominantly known and is still known for his very poetic texts. And in this case, he addresses the unequal distribution and selective implementation of France's universalist values. Actually, I'm gonna, I think, sort of flow seamlessly from Melanie's presentation. In a succinct punchline, which I think is very effectively captured by the image behind the quote, which I hope is not too obscured by the text, which is taken from rapper Youssoupha, who Melanie mentioned already, from his video for the song Menace de Mort, which I think was released in 2012, and from which I've borrowed most of my slides, so you'll continue to see that as a running theme. I think this also captures very effectively what another rapper, Sami Bugsy, said when he said, and I'm translating, that, quote, "I learned to be guilty for crimes I didn't commit," unquote. The sentiment expressed here is not an unusual one, as we've already seen from Melanie's presentation. And when I came to this topic, I came to it with biased ears, because I grew up loving French rap, and I'd heard this many times before. But when I was approaching it academically, I wanted to take a step back and try to understand what was bringing about this sentiment and how ubiquitous it actually was. And so I did something which which is unusual certainly for me and perhaps also for cultural historians, and I built a data set. And for the data set, I constructed it according to two governing questions. The first one, I just want to see if this is, no, sorry. The first one, as you can see labeled number 1, was, is French rap always political as it's reputed to be? And we can discuss what I intended by the term political later, because I think I don't have time to go into it here, but I did have a definition in mind. And the second one, it was, where do French rappers come from? And that can be further divided into two parts. So the first, the image labeled number 2 is the banlieue, because that, as Melanie already talked about a bit, is sort of inextricably linked to the idea of French rap. And the second is immigration, because the image of the immigrant is also very linked to French rap. So I wanted to understand to what extent this was actually the case. And so this is the, I'm drawing from my data. It's a preliminary data set, so I'm revising the statistics at the moment, but I don't think that the percentages will change all that much. And as you can see here, this is the geographical distribution. So I made a grouping of all the rappers in France who had released any songs or albums between 1981 and 2012. In the end, I had about 493 either groups or individuals or collectives, and then I looked at the banlieue or and the region of origin. So you can see there's a high concentration. In fact, just over 70% of the rappers in my data set came from the area around the Île-de-France, which also happens to be the area with the highest concentration of those of immigrant descent or origin in France. And then you can see down there, there's Marseille, which is also which falls very much in line with what is to be expected, I think, for as people who listen to French rap. This is the next. So that proved, the link with the banlieue, that music was coming from the banlieue, but not necessarily made for the banlieue, and we can talk about that a little bit later. The second one shows that there's at least 51 countries of origin of rappers in the data set that I built. And you can see here that there is a strong link to immigration, but it's not necessarily the construct of the immigrant that's widely propagated, particularly in political discourse, because there's a huge diversity of countries here that are not always apparent in those polemics. And I think it also shows that it's not necessarily just a post-colonial migration story, and I found that really interesting. Then this is what I came to in terms of to what extent the lyrics were politicized. So you can see that more than 85% of the rappers in the data set were at some point political and are actively engaging in political discourse, particularly aimed at the state. During at some point in their careers, and there you can see the distribution by continent of the rappers' origins. I have a lot more statistics, but I'm not going to share them right now because I think we don't necessarily have time, but I'm happy to go into the details of this if there's any questions later on. So basically all three stereotypes or associations with French rap, that it's political, that it's linked to the banlieue, and that it tends to be predominantly the voice of those of immigrant descent or origin, turned out to be, statistically at least, true. And here we can come back to the term other that I mentioned in the beginning. You can see here, it's just a handful of samples that I didn't translate because I just highlighted the words that refer to different communities, and you can see here there's a huge range in terms of references because they refer to different origins, ethnicities, races, and religions, so much so as to defy any kind of categorization. And this is apparent across time and across artists, and it shows that the idea of representation goes beyond just the community from which the rapper himself, and it is predominantly a male discourse at this point. It still is, I would say, but it's changing a little bit now. And so it's not just about the rapper representing where he comes from or the people with whom he associates, but the connections go a bit beyond that. Some of the words used to describe other communities are problematic, are in themselves quite loaded. Sometimes they're used ironically, but not always, and that also, I think, is an important nuance to take note of, because just identifying with a wider community doesn't necessarily mean that prejudice is always absent. But it does show that there's a feeling of belonging, and this was the question that I was asking myself: what is bringing all of these people together? And this is where the angle of ostracism and common marginalization came into play. Because effectively, this group of people were being brought together by a feeling of being marginalized. So they didn't necessarily have other things in common. There may not have been cultural similarities or religious similarities, but they were being discriminated against, often violently, by the society in which they found themselves. And it was usually based on a sense of perception, whether through name, look, or behavior. And I think in this case it goes back to the diversity of countries from which these rappers come, that it's not always a racial or ethnic discrimination. It can also be based on a perception of otherness that comes from other factors. But it often is racist, and it often is ethnic, so that's also important to highlight. And what brings them together is this marginalization, and it's funny that you mentioned the Sixth Republic, because that's exactly what they're trying to advocate for. Is they have a vision where they want to exist in a state that's more tolerant, a republic that pulls them in. And in that sense, what I found, at least, was through the analysis of lyrical discourse, is that it's not revolutionary in the sense of wanting to tear down the system. They don't necessarily want to destroy what exists. They just want to be able to fully exercise their rights that they feel they are being denied. So it's about access rather than revolution, and I think that's a very common theme that recurs throughout the rap songs that I looked at. And so the conclusion of my research, sadly, was that this ends up being the experience of most of the rappers. There's a lot of things that were also, there were some things that were missing from my data set. There's a lot of things I wasn't able to explore because I didn't have the time. Gender is a very interesting aspect, and I looked also at the politicization of female rappers, and actually I can't remember now, I had 14 female rappers that I was able to find lyrics and information for in this time period, and they were split half-half. So half of them were politicized and half of them were not, and when they were politicized in a very similar way to their male counterparts, so they weren't necessarily trying to embrace feminist rhetoric as I guess we might have hoped or wanted, and that could be because of the circumstantial sort of difficulties and constraints of the industry in which they find themselves. But effectively, rappers end up depicting a nation-state that's unwilling to acknowledge the reality of its portrait because of its own projected self-image. So France's universalism ends up clashing with its inability to confront the reality of the people that it now contains in the contemporary world. During my research, there was one thing that was absent. If you remember the pie chart, the presence of voices from the African continent was overwhelming compared to the others. But there were almost no rappers of Asian origin, and I found that particularly interesting because, of course, there's a large number of migrants from the former French colonies in Asia, and I was wondering if perhaps there were other modes of their expression, perhaps this was not something towards which they naturally gravitated, and why that might be. As far as I'm aware, there's no research on this, so I wasn't able to find my answers directly, but recently in the research that I'm now doing going forward, I'm looking into rap coming from other countries, and I found this rapper from Vietnam, and I was just enjoying the music, but she had the translation of her lyrics, and you can see she mentions Napoleon and French statues, and she kind of wants to take back it sounded to me like she wanted to take back the sort of power of existing and belonging within Vietnam. So my next project is now to look at the spaces like Congo, Vietnam, and where there's a lot of music that's coming out, and how they might refer and deconstruct this idea of the colonial past in their own voices. I'll just stop for now.